This is a complete beginner guide for rendering in digital painting. You learn everything about rendering, what it is, how to do it step by step, and how to improve your rendering. And I'll give a lot of helpful tips and tricks along the way so that you can avoid beginner mistakes. So let's get started. So what is rendering? Rendering in digital painting is the process of taking a picture from a rough state to a more polished, finished state. It is usually done in several distinct stages that each serve a specific purpose. It all starts with a sketch. That sketch can then be worked on to get a cleaner, preliminary drawing. Then flat colors are put down, light and shadow are added, and colors get blended. And finally you add details. When most artists talk about rendering, what they mean is actually lighting and shading and adding details to your painting. Now, one thing that's very important, we will look at these stages in isolation, and you can actually paint this way. It's especially helpful for beginners because you can concentrate on each step separately. As you become more advanced though, these steps become naturally blurred and you can actually paint several of these steps at the same time. For example, an experienced artist might not do a preliminary drawing or even a sketch at all and just jump straight into flat colors and start the painting. And afterwards he might add light and shadow and also paint some details in between while also blending the colors at the same time. Now, let's try looking at these stages in an actual painting I recently did. Like I said, the first step is the sketch. The sketch is the first rough scribble of the initial idea of your painting. Here you try to simplify what's in your head and actually just start putting something down on the canvas. The goal really is just to get started at first. You establish the composition, which means the placement of all the elements in your painting, like characters and objects, and you work on the basic perspective of the painting and the poses of your characters. Some tips for this stage are to just keep it loose and roughly scribble, and don't lose yourself in details yet. That comes at a later stage. This is really just for the placement of the elements and to get the basics right, like the perspective and the proportions. So don't overthink it, just get started. Next up is the preliminary drawing. The preliminary drawing is a refined and cleaner version of your first sketch. This is an optional step and like I said, many artists skip this. Whether you do this or not depends on your personal painting style and what you want your final artwork to look like. If you are a beginner and lack experience, you probably should do this step. A preliminary drawing can help you get a much cleaner result and act as a kind of roadmap for your painting, so you know where you actually have to put those colors. Now, if you're more experienced, you can skip this step, you don't need to do it. Many artists actually go from the sketch right into the coloring. Be careful though, if you want to do comic art like DC or Marvel superhero stuff, this style really lives and dies by the quality of the lines. You really need a clean drawing for this. But other than that, the goal of the preliminary drawing is just to create a cleaner version of your sketch so that you have a base to put your colors on. Next up is flatting. Flatting is the process of putting down the base colors. In this step you put down the basic colors of your characters and objects, without thinking about light and shadow and details like textures. For example, if the pants of your character are blue, you just paint a flat blue color inside the lines of that part of your drawing. And the only goal here is to establish a color scheme for your painting. Like what actual colors do the objects and characters in your scene have? Like the costume and the weapon and the skin and the hair, or whatever you're painting. In this painting I used another approach though. Since the scene is very dark and there's only one direct light source, I started by painting very dark silhouettes. The actual colors only get revealed by the light. A good idea here is to paint the colors on a different layer than the lines. And if you then set the upper layer to the blending mode multiply, the lines will actually show through. And this will make the flatting process much easier. Now, the next step is where it actually gets interesting, and that is adding light and shadow. Adding light and shadow is what actually makes your digital painting look more three-dimensional. In this stage you focus on shading your painting. The first step is to separate your flat colors into two areas, one light area and one shadow area. In my opinion, this is the simplest way to approach shading in the beginning. Either an area is hit by light and therefore bright, or it's in shadow and therefore dark. And this stage can really make or break your painting. It involves a lot of complicated things like midtones and highlights and reflected light and whatnot. I'll put 2 beginner videos in the description of this video to help you get started with this. The goal here is to establish the basic lighting situation of your painting. How many lights do you have in your scene, how bright are they and what color are they? One tip here is that you could maybe paint light and shadow on different layers. Keep your flat colors on one layer and then add shadows and light on another layer, maybe even 2 layers, one for each. This way you can change the colors of light and shadow separately, and you can actually give your painting a dramatically different look in a short amount of time if you want to. Next up is blending colors. And blending is actually a huge part of the rendering process. Blending is a process of mixing 2 neighboring colors to create a smooth transition between them. Because in nature, light and shadow rarely create really harsh edges, and instead light and shadow often transition into each other smoothly. And this is what you achieve with blending. But how do you know how soft you should paint the shadow transitions? When to use hard edges, soft edges, how soft should the edges be? Now here are some general rules for this. Paint completely hard edges where there's actually a hard edge, like at the edge of a table, for example. And then paint smoother transitions where there's actually a rounded surface, like on a ball, for example. Thirdly, cast shadows on the ground, for example, usually have harder edges than normal shadows. And lastly, the brighter the light source, usually the harder the shadow edges. Now, one important tip here is to not make your transitions too smooth, because if you blend too smoothly, that can actually make your paintings look fake. Now, if you're painting something like a brand new robot or something like that, okay, go for it if that's your style, if that's what you want to achieve. But other than that, I would suggest keeping the transitions a little bit rougher to keep a more painterly look, if you know what I mean. And lastly, we have the step of adding textures and details. By now, your digital painting should actually look quite good and three-dimensional already. But depending on the art style you are after, it can still feel like something's missing. And that's when it's time to add details and textures. These make your whole painting look more interesting because they kind of give the eye something to explore. And as an added bonus, they can make your painting look more realistic, if that's what you're after. Now, here are 2 important tips for this stage. First, don't draw too many details. This can really ruin your painting because if you draw details everywhere, it's kind of overbearing for the eye to look at and you don't really know what's the area of most importance, and it's so much to look at that you're actually kind of overwhelmed and it just doesn't look good most of the time. It's just too much. Instead, you can actually increase the amount of details in the focus areas of the painting. In those areas that you really want the viewer to look at, that are of most interest, increase the details there. In the rest of the painting, keep your details a little bit lower and don't paint that many details. This way you can actually kind of guide the viewer's eye to those areas of the painting that you actually want him or her to look at. So now you should understand what rendering actually is and how to make the most of each stage. But what if your paintings still look bad? How do you actually improve your rendering effectively? For this, I really recommend you to check out this video of mine. Thanks for watching.